this video, we're going to be taking one of the existing models from the Pokemon games and sculpting it into a realistic version worthy of becoming the next detective. If you want to see how that's done, stick around to see which Pokemon I'll be tackling today. To start a sculpt, you need a base mesh. Now, we could take the time to create one ourselves, or we could head over to this website, which has a bunch of the game models we can use as a starting point. Now, these are game models, so they're not necessarily optimized for sculpting. There's a bunch of extra geometry for the eyes, and some meshes are joined that would be much easier to sculpt if we were to separate them first. So to start with, I'm just going through and cleaning everything up, getting it ready to sculpt on. I always like to sculpt a character with their mouth slightly open to make it easier to sculpt teeth and gums. However, most rigs work better if the character's mouth is closed, so although I'll do my sculpting with the mouth open, before I rig I'll always go back and close it again. Eyes are one of the hardest parts to get right, so I like to put spheres in as early as possible to start sculpting around their shape. Eyelids are also something that a lot of beginners forget to add. And an eye without eyelids looks really creepy. So once I have eyeballs in place, I like to add the eyelids in really quickly, as they can have a dramatic effect on the expression of your character. There's many different sculpting methods, but my preferred way is using Topo. This tool automatically updates your geometry as you sculpt, meaning that you can pull out completely new shapes without stretching your polygons. It can be fairly intense on your computer though, so if your scene slows down too much, feel free to switch over to the remesh tool and just remesh when you need it, rather than every single stroke, like Topo does. I also know that I want some more realistic proportions. Wartortle is still a pretty cute Pokemon who waddles about. But I want a design that's going to be tough and battle ready, so longer arms and legs for running and fighting with more musculature. Something that's very cute about a lot of Pokemon designs but isn't all that realistic are their hands, or more to the point, their lack of hands. Both Wartortle and Charmeleon lack proper hands. They have claws coming out of the ends of their arms, which looks adorable, but I want my final character to be able to pick up and interact with objects in their world, which is extremely hard to do if you lack both palms and thumbs. So this is one area of the design I choose to redo. One thing a lot of artists struggle with is learning how dense their sculpts need to be. I regularly hear the advice, keep your sculpt as low poly as you can and only up-res when you absolutely need to. And there's definitely wisdom in that. Many artists up-res too quickly, which can result in lumpy models. However, on the flip side, using the smooth brush on a low poly sculpt just makes the sculpt collapse in on itself, like you can see it doing here with the creases in the shell. To get nice smooth shapes, you actually need quite a lot of polygons. So be aware that adding too many polygons before you've got your broad shapes right will give you strange lumps. But also don't be afraid to add detail once you're confident you've got those shapes right. Topo is great for this, as it allows you to add or remove detail simply by changing your brush settings. Wartortle's shell provides some really fun opportunities to sculpt in fat and wrinkles. When sculpting, try and think of how everything is pushing up against everything else. In the case of the shell, it's relatively easy to think of where the skin and fat will press up against bone and shell, and create mounds. But this is true all over the body too. Fat and skin is pressing up against bone and cartilage, especially in areas like elbows, knees, shoulders and collarbones, and anywhere around the skull. One of the things that I love most about Topo is your ability to go in and lower the resolution of your sculpt. There are times, like when I want to extend Wartortle's neck, where the dense polygons create a really lumpy mesh. Lowering the resolution and getting the shapes right, and then continuing to smooth it slightly before up-resing again, allows you to get rid of this lumpiness. Pro tip, at some stage just make sure that the jaw will close properly by masking off the area and pulling or rotating it into place. I can't tell you the number of times I've got to the rigging stage only to find out the jaw doesn't hinge properly and my character ends up with some kind of strange underbite that needs to be corrected. A lot of Wartortle's body is hidden beneath the shell, which makes it really difficult to figure out his proportions, like where the shoulders should connect. I temporarily hid the shell and threw in some rough spheres just to help get me a better idea of what his anatomy would look like underneath. I'll often do things like this, like putting in placeholders to help me visualize shapes and then delete them later on. I really wanted my version of Wartortle to have webbed fingers, insinuating that he has powerful arms for swimming, so I added some extra finger joints to make the fingers longer and use a simple sphere to add the webbing. Then I used the remesh tool to connect all of these parts into the one mesh. Getting flat feet is always hard just using the regular brushes. Don't forget that you have the trim brushes at your disposal. These kind of work like booleans while in sculpt mode. They're perfect for getting sharp edges while sculpting hard surfaces or for trimming the lumpy bits off the bottom of feet. Just like booleans though, they do produce some strange topology, so it's worth quickly going over them with Dyn Topo turned on to rebuild those polygons. Eyelids are surprisingly thick, and it's something I see a lot of people get wrong when they're starting out, myself included. Despite their relative size, the eyeball sits back quite a long ways behind the lid, giving it plenty of room to blink. Try and make sure that your sculpts include this thickness and don't just smoothly disappear into the eyeball. spent a lot of time playing around with his ears. Technically Wartortle have fur, or maybe even feathers on their tail and ears, but try as I might, I just couldn't make it look right on the ears. The tail, as you'll see later, turns out okay with some hair particles, but the ears just always looked kind of ridiculous. I think because we naturally think of turtles as reptiles, and modern reptiles just don't have feathers or fur. I even looked at a bunch of dinosaur evolutions where they were kind of at this halfway point between dinosaur and bird, and I just couldn't make it look right. So instead I decided to change up the ear design in favour of something more like a seaweed or coral. The idea being that the shapes would help these creatures camouflage in the wild. You could even do something interesting with regional varieties and have different ear shapes depending upon their environment. For the coral shapes, I like to think of fractals, so there's some big shapes that get pulled out of the ear, and then some smaller shapes get pulled out of those, then tiny shapes out of those, progressively getting smaller and smaller. The tails here are just a placeholder, so I can get a proper feel for the silhouette. You'll see later on I replace these with meshes that have much better topology. I'm getting happy with the overall shapes now, and I feel like I'm ready to start adding the extreme details like scales and wrinkles. But those details will massively slow Blender down if I try and sculpt them with Topo. What I need to do is use the multi-res modifier to sculpt those details, but for that we first need to retopologize. My tool of choice for doing retopology is Retopoflow, a paid add-on by the CG Cookie team. I think this is the best method for retopology in Blender, but there are other ways of doing it with the default Blender tools. If you're interested in learning more about retopology, I have a 3-part series covering some of the most popular methods. There'll be a link in the description. I think a lot of people overcomplicate topology. For characters like this, most of the detail will be picked up through the displacement map. The main thing to think about with your topology is where the edges will bend and crease. So you want to make sure that you have good edge loops going around things like the eyes and the lips, as well as around wrists, knees, and elbows. The details will ultimately end up being carried along when your topology moves, so as long as you get these loops right, everything should follow. So don't worry about making your topology line up to every tiny little detail, just make sure you capture the major details and let things like the scales and skin pores come along for the ride. It's good practice when doing lips or eyes or anything that opens and closes really, to have the same number of polygons on the top as there are on the bottom. An uneven number of vertices can sometimes lead to gaps appearing where these openings can't quite close perfectly. Laying out your topology is somewhat similar to blocking out your base mesh when sculpting. Start with the big major shapes first, such as the eyes, mouth, eyebrows, and a very important one, the nasal label fold, which are these lines below the cheek that appear when someone smiles. With these major shapes in place, it becomes much easier to bridge the gaps between them. Usually these gaps are just strips of polygons, so aside from making sure you have the same number of edges for each patch, it's usually not too hard to join them all up. Fingers are quite detailed and usually require a lot more polygons than the arms, so building these edges that kind of loop back on themselves allows you to add extra details near the finger joints, but reduce the number of edges going all the way up the arm. Learning this layout is a vital skill for retopology, and I'll use it later for all sorts of different places. I'll do something similar for the toes leading up to the legs, and the face, which usually requires a lot more detail, will also have edges that loop back on themselves around the neck or the top of the skull. As much as I love Retopoflow for quickly getting down lots of polygons, I've found a handful of places where its shrink wrap tends to give me issues. These are almost always areas of extremely fine detail, such as the eyes here, and often things like nostrils or fingernails. For these areas, I'll usually drop back into normal editing mode and create them manually. You'll see here that I do the same thing with the interior of the mouth. Any shape that has kind of a cave shape is always a pain to retopologize, and I almost always find it's easier to model these areas by hand. In the case of the mouth interior, or the mouth bag, creating a UV sphere and simply bridging it with the lips is much easier. Next up is the shell, which is much easier to retopologize. The main thing I want to watch out for here is making sure I have the right edge loops around the major creases in the shell. Fortunately, these won't move during animation, so topology isn't really too much of a concern here, but certain edge flows are better for sculpting our higher level details on. Better edge flow here means less subdivisions needed at render time, which will ultimately save us some precious minutes when it comes time to render. There wasn't really anything difficult about the retopology for the back of the shell, although with all of these shapes it was definitely repetitive and time consuming. The only major challenge here was making sure I had the right number of edge loops to connect all of the different sections. With retopology done, I need to reproject the detailed sculpt onto the new mesh with our good topology. We do this by adding a multi-res modifier and adding a few levels of subdivision. We then add a shrink wrap modifier, set the projection type to project, with both positive and negative ticked. You'll notice some areas may break pretty badly here, namely where all the holes in the shell are, like around the neck, arms and legs. To fix this, I add a vertex group and add all of the broken areas to that group. I can then use the vertex group option in the shrink wrap modifier to exclude these vertices from the shrink wrap. This means that those vertices won't move at all, and thus won't break. If you'd like a more detailed breakdown on how to do all of this reprojection and set up displacement or normal maps, I have a couple of videos that go over all of that process step by step. Here's the link to the displacement tutorial. Once you're happy, you can apply the shrink wrap modifier. This will bake all of that detail down into your multi-res modifier, which you can later turn into a displacement map. Also make sure to save a backup before applying your shrink wrap, just in case you've missed something and we need to go back later. Next up, I want to do the same process to the body. Because the body is so much more detailed, there's going to be a lot more things that can and probably will break. The easiest way to fix these is to go over all the breaking parts of your retopology model and just lightly sculpt them so that they're sitting outside the detailed sculpt. For the areas slightly underneath the shell, I do the vertex group method again, removing a couple of edge loops from the shrink wrap. Since these are under the shell, we don't really see them anyway, so it doesn't hurt to just remove them. Unfortunately, the ears were just a nightmare here, and the easiest thing for me to do was to completely smooth them out and then just redo this coral pattern on the new retopologized mesh. With the new retopo mesh prepared and the multi-res modifier attached, I can now crank up the levels of subdivision and start sculpting all my really high resolution details. With a bit of luck, you should find that your scene is much faster now that you're using the multi-res modifier. I have quite a powerful computer, and with the multi-res I can get this sculpt up to around 50 million polygons. Now, if you're working with an older machine or a laptop, don't expect to get quite that high, but hopefully with the improvements in the last few Blender updates, you should be able to get at least a couple of million polygons before your computer starts to lag. I give the entire model a quick sculpting pass to emphasize all of the muscle details. Remember that once you texture your model and add things like subsurface scattering, a lot of this detail will get lost, so don't be afraid to overemphasize it a little at this sculpting stage. As always, I need to iterate how important getting reference is. If you want your sculpts to look realistic, the best way to achieve this is to base it on real life. Turtles, for example, have a very specific pattern to their scales. Don't just make these up, get some real life images and just copy them. That's not to say that you can't break away from these designs, just make sure that you know when and more importantly why you're breaking away from them. As amazing as all of these alpha maps are, don't rely on them completely. They'll do a great job at laying down a ton of detail really quickly, but make sure to come back and manually blend between the different areas, as your alphas won't usually line up perfectly. Adding shapes on top of other shapes not only helps to blend between areas, but gives depth to your designs. Large shapes like the scales on the head will attract your attention, but then having smaller details within those shapes will help break up the specularity on your model. Remember what we did with the coral shape on the ears. Large shapes leading into smaller shapes, leading into even smaller shapes, like a fractal. This kind of design is much more interesting to look at. When sculpting these details, always think about the underlying anatomy. Areas such as the eyelids or lips need to have a lot of movement, so they'll tend to have looser skin, and thus more wrinkles will develop. But the eyelids then butt up against the bony eye sockets, so the wrinkles will end there and you might just get more solid scales that don't move so much. I want Wartortle to look like he's been through a few battles, so I use a bunch of cracks and scar alphas to add damage to his shell. These kind of details are also perfect for turning off your symmetry. In reality, no face or body is perfectly symmetrical, and adding a scar across the face or damage to equipment, clothing, or in this case a shell, is a really easy way to break up that symmetry. I'd already sculpted both the tongue and the teeth for my Charmeleon sculpt, and since these details will be largely hidden inside the mouth, I copy and paste them onto Wartortle. There's no point reinventing the wheel if you don't have to. Sculpting the interior of the mouth is always a painful job, but don't forget that you have tools that allow you to hide parts of your sculpt. These are unbelievably useful for getting to those hard to reach places. And ladies and gentlemen, our Wartortle sculpt is complete, but that's not the entire project. In the next video, we'll be UV unwrapping, creating displacement maps, and taking this model into Substance Painter for texturing. So until then, enjoy Wartortle in all his sculpted glory.